Today I'm going to be showing you how to make Puerto Rican Pasteles de Arroz, which is basically a Puerto Rican rice dumpling. They are rice and meat wrapped and cooked in a banana leaf. But first, let's start with the ingredients that we're going to need. For this recipe, we use 2 cups of medium grain rice because short grain sticks better because they are starchier than long grain. We also need half a teaspoon of salt, 1.5 teaspoons of sazon, 2 tablespoons of achote oil, which will be used to make the rice and the meat. The achote oil gives the recipe a nice golden color and a very unique smoky flavor. We also add manzanilla olives and pieces of pimiento morrón. Now, one of the base flavors in this recipe is the Puerto Rican sofrito, which will be used to make the rice and the meat. This gives it that unique Puerto Rican taste. For the meat filling, we need 1.5 pounds of pork meat. Right here, I'm using pork butt, but you could also use pork shoulder, and it works great too. You could use any kind of pork, any cut you like, as long as it has a good amount of fat. We also need 1.5 teaspoons or 1 packet of sazon, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of adobo, and half a teaspoon of crushed oregano. We also need 1.5 tablespoons of achote oil, 1.5 cups of water, 1 tablespoon of tomato sauce, and 1 tablespoon of sofrito. The first thing we need to do is to cut the meat. Now, before cutting the meat, make sure you have a sharp knife. My knife was kind of dull and I should have changed it, but I kept using that knife, so get a good knife. What I first do is cut the pork into steaks. Then I like to cut it into 1/2 inch thick strips. Then we cube the strips to about 1/2 inch thick chunks. Now I always suggest that if you want, you can always cut the meat into smaller pieces. Cutting the meat smaller is good because I feel like you can add more meat to the rice, but never cut it bigger because it's going to stick out of the rice. Plus, the smaller you cut the meat, the quicker it will cook and the quicker that it will tenderize. Now for the filling, what I'm using here is pork because it's my favorite, but you could use basically any filling you like, but the most popular ones tend to be pork and stewed shredded chicken. And while it's not common, you could always use seafood as a stuffing. Good options are adding bacalao or salted cod or even shrimp. But the good thing about this recipe is that you could customize it to your needs. Like you can make these pasteles vegetarian or even vegan by just changing the stuffing into a vegetable one or even tofu. Now in a medium-sized caldero or pan, we add 1.5 tablespoons of achote oil over high heat. Be careful if you choose to use an enamel pan because the achote oil can stain your pan. Then we add 1 tablespoon of sofrito. Then we add the tomato sauce and we mix. This mix right here is going to have your kitchen smelling delicious. We make sure to stir and then we add 1.5 teaspoons of sazon or 1 packet, the salt, the oregano, and the adobo. Then we saute this for 2 minutes and make sure to stir while it's cooking to make sure it doesn't burn. Then we need to sear the pork. Add it to your pan and mix it in with the sofrito. Sear it for 5 minutes and constantly stir it to prevent it from burning. Now the sofrito is an important ingredient in this recipe. If you don't know what it is, the sofrito is just a mix of aromatic vegetables like garlic, onions, peppers, cilantro, and culantro. You can always buy sofrito in big chains, supermarkets, or a Latin store. If you can find any, you could always make your own. I will leave you my sofrito recipe and my sofrito substitute recipe link in the description below just in case you want to make your own. We then add the water. Mix everything and make sure you scrape the bottom of the pan to release all of those bits stuck to the bottom of the pan. That will add flavor to the broth. Lower the heat to medium. Then cover and cook the pork meat for 40 minutes. Once the 40 minutes have passed, you should have super tender meat that you could easily break apart with your hand. Now while the meat was cooking, in those 40 minutes is when we prepare for the rest of the recipe. Now to prepare the rice, we need a medium-sized pan or a caldero like the one I'm using here. Set your heat to medium-high and add 2 tablespoons of achote oil. Then add your 2 tablespoons of sofrito. This we need to saute or sofreír as we say it in Spanish for 1 minute, making sure to stir to prevent it from burning. We then add the rice. Now this is where my recipe is very different from the rest you see online. This is because most of the other recipes for pasteles de arroz add water or some type of broth of the cooked meat to the rice. But I always remember my grandmother making these, but she never added any type of liquid. I even asked my aunt to see if I remember wrong, but no, this is the way my grandmother used to make it. I remember just like I'm doing here. She will add the sazon, the salt, and cook the rice. Then the trick is that you have have to cook the rice for 15 minutes, but you have to do so while stirring. The rice will cook, but not all the way because the oil acts as a barrier, which makes it harder for the grain to absorb a lot of moisture, which is super helpful when cooking because the rice won't absorb as much water when boiling. Now we need to prepare the base for our pasteles. We need to prepare the banana leaves. What we first have to do is amortiguar the leaf, which sadly I really don't know the exact translation in English, but basically what it means is that we need to pass the leaf through the heat. You could do this on a gas stove or an electric stove. You could do this in a gas stove or in an electric stove like I'm doing here. You'll see how the heat makes the leaf shinier. That's how you know when to move around so it won't burn. Then we need to clean them to remove any dirt that they might have. You could do this with a damp paper towel or a clean kitchen towel. You could find these usually at a Latin supermarkets or online. You will also need papel para pasteles, which is the paper and can be found at Latin stores and also online. You're also going to need some cooking twine or cooking thread. I will drop all the links below to all of these products you see here just in case you can't find them near you. Then what you need to do is cut the leaves to almost the size of each sheet of paper. Then we put one banana leaf to each piece of paper. Now some people wonder if you could use a different paper to make pastele, like wax paper or parchment paper, but sadly you can't. Those type of papers are not meant to get soaking wet like the paper for pasteles. Then we need to prepare the cooking thread. I usually cut it to 36 inches, which is almost as the same as measuring 3 times the pastel paper. You will need to cut 6 pieces because this recipe yields a half a dozen of pasteles. Now we need to first prep the area where we're going to work on. You need to cover the surface you're gonna make the pasteles on. What I like to do is take old newspaper and set them on my counter. Then I also grab any paper bags I have. I open them and I layer them over the newspaper. This is going to help us, 1, to avoid that our surfaces get stained with the achote oil, and 2, it is also gonna make cleaning super faster and easy. All you have to do is throw away the papers and the area will be clean. Then we just set the table with everything we need. For each pastel, you want to add about half a cup of rice and 1/4 cup of your stuffing. First, we want to add about 1/4 cup of teaspoon of achote to the banana leaf and spread it around the middle. Then we add half a cup of rice. You can also use a spoon. You will need to add 3 hefty spoonfuls of rice. Then you want to spread it around a little bit until the rice is nice and flat. We then add 1/4 cup of the stuffing. Then goes the manzanilla olives, which I had to cut in half so I could place one on the top and in the bottom. I also put a piece of pimiento morrón on top. Now comes the tricky part for a lot of people, which is closing up the pastel. What I like to do is I like to fold the paper so it could reach about 2/3 of the paper. Then I bring back the paper and the rice just a little bit so I could kind of compact the rice. I then fold the paper with the pastel to the front twice. Then fold in one of the corners to the side where the line of the paper is. Tap the pastel on your surface so the rice can go down. Then fold the other half. What I like to do is to make my ends almost touch, and that's how I know that I'm making the pastel the same size consistently. Then we flip the pastel to tie it up. There's many different ways of doing this, but the way that I like to do it is to take my thread, make a little loop on one end, then put it under the pastel and put the loose thread through the loop. I like to do this in the longest part of the pastel. Then we just have to tie around the pastel the rest of the thread. You can also slow down the video a little bit to see if it helps you see how it's done. You could slow down the video up a little bit if it helps you see how it's done. Then you just have to repeat this process 6 more times. This is a great recipe to double and make more because you do this once and you could freeze your pasteles for up to 6 months. These pasteles are very popular during the holidays, but they are consumed year round. There's a popular version where there are the mini pastelitos, which is believed that was the first version of the pastelitos, the mini one. Now, a question that I have gotten before is that if you could use cooked leftover rice, and while you technically can, I wouldn't recommend it. This is because it will have a different texture. Same happens with the pasteles that the rice is cooked with a little bit of broth. Those type of pasteles, the rice tends to be a little stickier, but the way I do it, you get a very loose grain. Another note on the rice is that you could take any rice base to make this. A popular one is to take the same ingredients you use in a Puerto Rican arroz con gandules or a rice with pigeon peas to make these pasteles, and it's absolutely delicious. Then we need need a big pot with water over high heat. Here I'm using a medium-sized pot because I only wanted to make 2. But if you're making more pasteles, make sure that your pot is big enough for your pasteles and the water. You need at least 10 cups of water and 2 tablespoons of salt. Then cover and cook for 1 hour. But make sure to keep an eye on the pot because usually halfway through, the pot will always need more water. The pasteles should always be covered in water while cooking. Then before serving, make sure to drain each pastel. If not, you'll have a watery mess on your plate. You could serve the pasteles in the paper where you cook them, or you could remove the paper by cutting the thread, opening the paper, and slowly let the pastel slide onto the plate. Then you'll see how delicious pasteles de arroz are. Some people think that eating a pastel is the same thing as eating any rice with meat on the side, but let me tell you that is not. The pasteles have a very distinct flavor thanks to that banana leaf. Plus the texture is completely different. The rice will be super moist yet super fluffy, but dry at the same time, if it makes sense. This is a recipe that is really worth the work. This is a labor of love. Pasteles are usually made with family and friends. It is a Puerto Rican tradition. And here you can see my baby test tasting the pasteles I made, and she agrees they are super delicious. The full recipe will be in the description below. Buen provecho and thanks for watching.